You believe you know the difference between good and evil, not in a naive way, not in the way a child believes it with the simple certainty of fairy tales and clear villains. You believe it in the considered adult way, having lived enough, seen enough, thought enough to feel that your moral compass is genuinely yours, that the values you hold, the things you call right and wrong, the lines you won't cross, the principles you defend, are the product of your own honest reckoning with the world. What if they're not? What if the moral framework you've been living inside, the one that tells you what's good and what's evil, what's virtuous and what's shameful, what kind of person you should be and what kind of person you should avoid becoming, was constructed long before you arrived, built by people with specific interests, specific fears, specific needs that had very little to do with your flourishing and very much to do with their own? What if the values you experience as most deeply yours are precisely the ones you've examined least because they arrived so early and so completely that they became invisible, not like furniture in a room, but like the room itself? This is the question Friedrich Nietzsche spent his philosophical life pressing on, not gently, not with the academic courtesy that allows dangerous ideas to be discussed without actually landing, with a hammer, his word, his image, tapping at the foundations of Western morality to find out which parts were solid and which parts, when struck, rang hollow. What he found disturbed him, and it should disturb you too. Not because it destroys the possibility of genuine values, but because it reveals how much work is required to actually have them, how rare genuine moral thinking actually is, and how much of what passes for conscience is really something considerably less flattering. Let's look at what's actually there.
Here is the assumption that almost every moral conversation you've ever had has been built upon. That good and evil are real, stable categories. That what we call good has always been good, and what we call evil has always been evil. That moral progress is the gradual discovery of these truths rather than their invention. That conscience is a direct line to something real rather than a cultural product with a history that can be traced. Nietzsche attacked this assumption with a precision that is still, more than a century later, genuinely difficult to sit with. In his Genealogy of Morals, he did something that sounds obvious but was philosophically radical. He asked where our moral categories actually came from, not what they claimed to be, where they actually originated. Who made them, under what circumstances, in service of what interests? And what he found, tracing the historical record with the specificity of someone who had actually done the reading, was that the categories of good and evil as we know them are not ancient wisdom gradually uncovered. They are the product of a very specific historical moment, a reversal, a transformation in values so complete that most people living inside its legacy have no idea the reversal happened. Before this reversal, in the older aristocratic moral systems Nietzsche examined, the primary moral distinction was not between good and evil, but between good and bad. And these terms meant something entirely different from what they mean now. Good meant noble, powerful, vital, self-directed, excellent in the specific sense of fully developed capacity. Bad, not evil, just bad, meant common, weak, without distinction, reactive, dependent.
These were descriptive categories before they were moral ones. The aristocratic value system began with the affirmation of a certain kind of life and defined its opposite as the lesser thing. Then something happened. Nietzsche called it the slave revolt in morality. And whether you agree with his historical account or not, the psychological mechanism he identified is real and traceable in your own inner life if you're willing to look. The people at the bottom of these ancient hierarchies, the ones defined as bad by the aristocratic value system, could not fight back directly. They lacked the power. So they did something more sophisticated. They inverted the values. They took the qualities that had been celebrated, strength, vitality, self-direction, pride, and reframed them as evil, dangerous, threatening, sinful. And they took the qualities of their own condition, weakness, humility, meekness, self-abnegation, and reframed those as good, virtuous, blessed, close to God. This inversion from the good-bad distinction to the good-evil distinction was not accomplished through argument. It was accomplished through centuries of moral and religious culture, through the systematic repetition of a framework in which the powerful were condemned and the powerless were elevated, in which pride was sin and humility was virtue, in which strength was suspect and suffering was meaningful, in which the qualities that make a person genuinely excellent in the sense of fully, specifically, capaciously themselves were reframed as the qualities that make a person dangerous, selfish, ungodly. Nietzsche was not saying the powerful were right and the powerless were wrong. He was pointing at something more disturbing, that the moral inversion was so complete, so thoroughly embedded in the cultural foundations of Western civilization, that the people living inside it have completely lost the ability to see it as an inversion. The values of the slave revolt feel like universal moral truth because they have been operating as the background of every moral conversation for so long. The question, and it is genuinely uncomfortable to sit with, is which of your deepest moral convictions are genuine wisdom arrived at through honest engagement with reality, and which are the inheritance of this inversion? Which of the things you call good are genuinely life-affirming, and which have been defined as good specifically because they are life-diminishing, because they serve the interests of systems that need people to be humble, self-sacrificing, and non-threatening?
Think about the experience of guilt, not abstract guilt, the specific, visceral, almost physical experience of having done something your conscience condemns. The tightening, the replaying, the specific internal voice that says, you should be ashamed of this. You are not the person you should be. That voice feels like the most intimate thing, the most genuinely yours. If anything in your inner life seems to originate directly from your own depths rather than from the outside world, it's that voice. Conscience feels like the self speaking to the self, the deepest part of you holding the rest accountable. Nietzsche thought this was one of the most important illusions to examine, not because conscience is always wrong, because the certainty that it is yours, that it originates in your own genuine moral reckoning rather than in the internalized voices of your culture, your family, your religion, your social environment, is almost certainly false. Here's the mechanism he identified. Human beings are extraordinarily social creatures. Our survival, for most of our evolutionary history, depended entirely on group membership.
The threat of exclusion was not metaphorical, it was genuinely dangerous. And so the systems that generate social conformity, including the internal ones, the ones that make you feel bad when you deviate from group norms, are ancient, powerful, and specifically designed to feel like your own voice rather than the group's. Because if you experienced the conformity pressure as external, as something being done to you by other people, you might resist it. But if you experience it as your own conscience, as the voice of your own deepest values, you don't resist it. You police yourself. And a person who polices themselves on the group's behalf is the most efficient possible conformity mechanism. No enforcement required, no visible coercion, no one to rebel against. This is what Nietzsche meant when he talked about the internalization of values, the process by which the group's requirements become the individual's convictions, by which the social penalty for deviation becomes the internal experience of guilt, by which the voice saying you shouldn't starts sounding like a parent or a priest or a community, and starts sounding like the deepest part of yourself. The practical implication of this is both simple and staggering. When you feel guilty, the first question worth asking is not, "What did I do wrong?" but "Whose standard am I measuring myself against?" And then, more uncomfortably, do I actually endorse that standard? Have I ever actually examined it? Or have I simply absorbed it so completely that it has become indistinguishable from my own judgment? This is not an invitation to abandon guilt as a moral signal. Some guilt is appropriate. Some internal resistance to our own behavior reflects genuine values that we have actually chosen and that we have actually violated. But a very significant portion of the guilt that most people experience, the guilt about ambition, about desire, about the assertion of genuine selfhood, about wanting things that the group finds threatening, that guilt is not genuine moral signal. It is the installed enforcement mechanism of a value system that benefits from your compliance. The difference is hard to feel from the inside, but it is not impossible to develop the capacity to feel it. It requires asking with each instance of guilt, is this pointing at something I genuinely believe was wrong, or is it pointing at something that was uncomfortable for someone else? Is this my conscience, actually mine, reflecting my own examined values? Or is this the internalized voice of a system that had specific reasons for wanting me to feel this way?
Here is one of Nietzsche's most provocative and, once you see it, most difficult to unsee observations about the specific content of the moral framework most of us have inherited. The values that are most consistently praised in Western moral culture, selflessness, humility, self-sacrifice, the subordination of individual desire to the needs of others, are values that are extraordinarily convenient for any system that needs people to be compliant. Not because self-sacrifice is never genuinely valuable, but because a moral framework that elevates it as the highest good, that makes the self-giving person the moral exemplar and the self-directed person morally suspect, produces exactly the kind of human being that institutions, hierarchies, and social systems need. Someone who has been trained to experience their own genuine needs and desires as less legitimate than everyone else's. Nietzsche pointed to what he called the ascetic ideal,
the glorification of self-denial, of the subordination of bodily and individual desires to spiritual or social obligations as the central organizing principle of this moral framework. And he noted something that is still uncomfortable to acknowledge. The ascetic ideal is remarkably useful to the people who enforce it. A person who has been taught that their own desires are suspect, that genuinely wanting things for themselves is selfish, that the good life is a life of service and self-denial, that person is extraordinarily easy to manage. They will work without demanding adequate compensation because taking care of themselves feels like selfishness. They will tolerate bad treatment because complaint feels like ingratitude. They will consistently prioritize others' needs because their own feel less legitimate. This is not a cynical conspiracy, it is a structural dynamic. The values that make individuals easiest to manage become, over time, the values that get the most moral praise. And the values that make individuals harder to manage, genuine self-directedness, the unapologetic pursuit of personal excellence, the refusal to subordinate genuine development to the comfort of the group, those values get associated with arrogance, selfishness, moral failure. The person who believes deeply in self-sacrifice as a primary virtue does not experience themselves as being managed, they experience themselves as being good. Every act of self-abnegation feels like an expression of their highest values, rather than an expression of a trained inability to tolerate the guilt that arises when you don't. When you call someone selfish for asserting their own needs, how much of that judgment is genuine moral wisdom, and how much is the threat response of someone whose own trained self-sacrifice feels undermined by the sight of someone who hasn't been similarly trained? These are not rhetorical questions with preset answers. They are genuine inquiries that require genuine honesty to engage with. And the honesty they require is the specific honesty of asking, what would I actually value if I'd been allowed to actually develop my own values, rather than simply inheriting those that best serve the systems around me? Here is where everything Nietzsche was pointing at converges into something practical rather than merely critical. The problem is not that values are impossible. The problem is that inherited values, values absorbed from the surrounding culture without examination, mistaken for your own convictions because they arrived before you had the tools to question them, are not genuinely yours. They are not the product of your honest engagement with reality. They are a hand-me-down moral framework wearing your name. And a life organized around a hand-me-down moral framework is not fully your life. It is a life organized around other people's answers to questions you were never actually allowed to ask. The alternative, the thing Nietzsche called the revaluation of all values, is not nihilism. It is not the claim that no values are real or that all moral positions are equally empty. It is the demanding, ongoing, genuinely difficult process of actually doing the work that genuine values require. What does this look like in practice? It looks like noticing which of your moral convictions generate anxiety when questioned, and specifically examining those ones, because genuine values can withstand examination. The conviction that is terrified by being questioned is almost certainly not a genuine value. It is an installed belief that has survived precisely by discouraging examination. It looks like tracing the origin of your guilt, not accepting it as direct moral signal, but asking, who taught me this was wrong? Under what circumstances? In service of whose interests? And do I, having actually looked at it clearly, actually agree? It looks like distinguishing between the discomfort of doing something genuinely wrong, which is real and worth attending to, and the discomfort of deviation from what others find comfortable. These can feel identical from the inside. They are not the same thing. It looks like developing the capacity to hold a moral position not because it is approved, but because you have genuinely examined it and found it to be true, because it survives contact with reality, because it reflects something you actually believe about how human beings should treat each other and themselves, not something you've been given by a system that needed you to believe it. This process is genuinely difficult. It is uncomfortable. It produces periods of real uncertainty, of not knowing what you think, of holding questions that don't yet have answers. Nietzsche was honest about this. He called the moment when inherited values begin to feel hollow, but new, genuine values haven't yet formed, the most dangerous passage. The moment of nihilism, the moment when the old framework has been seen through and the new one hasn't been built. But on the other side of that passage, for the person willing to stay with the discomfort long enough, is something that inherited values can never provide. The specific, grounded, tested confidence of a person whose values are actually theirs, who has examined what they believe and chosen it, who knows when they call something good or evil, why, not because they were told, because they looked. That kind of moral seriousness is rare. Nietzsche thought it was the rarest thing available, and he thought it was the only kind of goodness worth the name.
There is a specific courage required to examine your own values honestly, not the courage of battle or of public defiance, the quieter, more internal, considerably more difficult courage of being willing to find out that something you were certain of was not yours, that a conviction you've organized your life around was installed by a system with interests that may not align with yours. Most people never develop this courage, not because they're cowards in any ordinary sense, because the examination feels like the undermining of everything solid, because the moral framework, however inherited, functions as the floor you stand on, and deliberately examining the floor, actually testing its integrity rather than simply assuming it, requires being willing to discover that parts of it are hollow. But here is what Nietzsche understood, and what most of us need to hear. A floor you've actually tested holds differently than one you've simply been standing on. The values you've actually examined, that you've actually questioned, and, having questioned, actually chosen, are yours in a way that inherited values can never be. They are weight-bearing in a way that borrowed convictions are not. They will hold under pressure, in difficult moments, in the specific circumstances where your deepest convictions are actually tested, because you know what they're made of. The brutal truth about good and evil is not that they don't exist. It is that genuinely having a relationship with them, genuinely knowing what you believe and why, genuinely having values rather than being had by them, requires work that most people are never encouraged to do. The encouragement to do it is what Nietzsche was really offering.
under all the provocation, under all the discomfort, under all the deliberate difficulty of his thinking, an invitation to actually think, actually examine, actually choose, to have, in the end, values that are genuinely yours. That is the beginning of moral seriousness, and it is available to anyone willing to ask the question that most people find too uncomfortable to hold. Do I actually believe this, or was I simply told to?